Hello everyone, today we talk about the fragmentation of the Islamic Caliphate, the affirmation of the Emirate of Cordoba, and of the Abbasids of Baghdad. Back in the day, I used to make more Islamic history videos for reasons connected with the cycle content that, as you know, has some sort of return over time. I added more branches and so things got more diluted, but there is of course a lot about especially medieval Islam for a channel based on the medieval millennium to discuss, also in function of course of Christian European history, like in this case. Alright, recently we talked about Al-Andalus from a military point of view. There was plenty of fact of military historical content to make on that. Even more, we should really understand the system, how it worked politically, territorially, because it was sort of much more composite than we're prone to think. Of course, we gave precedence to a degree to the Christian Iberian powers, how they emerged from the north, essentially unhinging this apparently monolithic, but in fact not Islamic dominion. But it's important to really look at how the latter worked in order to understand how also the Christians succeeded in the Reconquista. Today we talk about another period, and mostly in just this overview of Islamic caliphal issues, mostly connected with the break of the Dar al-Islam from a simply political point of view. Also, like different religious currents, Islam is much more, sectary, right, fragmented and separated than the various, currents within Christendom that instead maintain a striking unity and sense of commitment towards secular authorities. On behalf of God, this is incredibly important to stress. We will come back on Christian history more soon. It's important to picture essentially what brought to this major break within Islamic unity in the mid-8th century. So barely 1 century after the prorompent Islamic conquests, and really a dozen years away fundamentally from the overstretching of the same Islamic conquest, like the halt of the same, first on the Talas River in the east against the Chinese, and on at Poitiers in 732 against the Franks. There are very heavy defeats also against the Byzantines, first at Constantinople, then in Anatolia. Those are majorly underrated. Constantinople 717 and Acroinon 740. Those are even more relevant considering that the bulk of Islamic power was coming from the Middle East at that point, and therefore Constantinople was just the most, pressured shield of Europe at that point against Arab expansionism. It's not just about military issues, also because up to that point, in fact, the Islamic expansion had been very successful. We could talk for hours and hours explaining the causes of that. I made at the very beginning of Schwerpunkt several years ago some general assessments about, for example, like the civilizational comparison between the Arabs and the Franks. Analyzing the peak of the so-called Islamic Golden Age, that regardless of course what some people say, also from a conservative point of view, was objectively an impressive phase in civilizational history, naturally understanding that it mostly capitalized on, for example, Byzantine, Sasanian cultures in many ways, but there is no doubt that the Arabs were able, mostly through, in fact, the local subjects that were essentially the heirs of that Romano-Persian tradition, and even more like before from a scientific, philosophical point of view of Hellenic one, to rework and to expand, also with a bit of injection of Indian influence. It's, by the way, very interesting that one of the single most productive areas in the Dar al-Islam in terms of properly intelligentsia was a peripheral region like the Khorasan, close essentially to the Khwarezm in Transoxiana, etc. That was, as you know, a frontier area with the steppes, so not overwhelmingly advanced, but historically had very important political and strategic relevance in controlling some major branches of the Silk Route in Western Eurasia, and had witnessed the growth of some important cities. If you look at Merv, that is one of the old Alexandrias, the Antiocheia in Margiana, right, would be destroyed by the Mongols, just like Baghdad. It was apparently the largest city in the world. Some doubt there, but before the destruction, but it's worth remembering. There are some regional cultural landscapes that we tend to sort of ignore. I realize, by the way, that from recent videos I made about Islamic history and warfare, that of course you tend to watch less this stuff. But remember, especially in medieval time, I understand the reason why, because this is largely a conservative right-wing channel, and we're of course here to explain what Catholic truly means, and observing the incredible push, especially of Latin-Germanic civilization, also over the Arabs, reversing the Islamic invasions, etc. But you know that on Schwerpunkt we've always talked about Islam. If anything, more recently we've mostly looked at the Ottomans in general, not just from the 1683 Vienna series, but in general, because you can't really have a complete understanding also of European warfare without the one of other continents, of other cultures. Now, aside from this, what is very important and fascinating here is considering the scale of power involved, the regional forces, the political and territorial balance across, in fact, immense length from the Atlantic to Central Asia, and all that lays in between, regions that, as we know, had also been particularly civilized also by the same Romans back in the day. So it's not really something you can do without. And I will keep making, of course, always comment on this. Three's prologue to this, that is, how did the Umayyads manage to consolidate their rule before being ousted in 750 as a ruling dynasty due to that Shia-oriented religious dissident movement among the Arabs settled, especially in Iran, who sought a truer connection to the Prophet. This movement garnered support from converts opposed to ethnic discrimination within the Islamic community. And the background here is really big. We will have to look at the origins of Islam also as far as the well-known traditional ones that were in part re-edited, revived, but also blended with this other religious, let's say, temper after the great sort of syncope of civilization that had occurred with the shrinking of the Roman Empire. Because a great deal of, say, moral, ethnic, political, religious beliefs were in fact much more shared than we think at the time. This is, as you know, great part of my punchline of the, say, arguably provocative content that I make. People are not aware of the essentially Catholic nature of all the empires in antiquity, by just definition what Catholic means. When you look at Islam, you can't unsee, of course, the fact that they overrun a big deal of powers. Through, by the way, a holy war that especially in the Arab case, was overwhelmingly influenced by the Iranian, the Persian, the Sasanian tradition. This is true also from a military point of view. It's true probably in the vision of power and how it manifested through divine grace. So we will talk about the early days of Islam, of the Rashidun Caliphate, and how the Umayyads had affirmed themselves. However, the major deal here that we're witnessing is how the Umayyads, after the first century of Islamic expansion, had been often criticized for their autocratic rule, favoritism towards the Arab elites, and the concentration of power within the Umayyad family. I explained countless times in other videos, including the recent ones about the Al-Andalus, that when we talk about Arabs at large, we're not looking at more than essentially Arabicized elites. However, with the Umayyads, in the early days of Islam, this trend, especially in the Middle East, that includes Arabia, so in geographically favoring also the spread of this Arab control, still at the head of basins, of pools, the endemic regions that were expression of previous nationalities and civilizations. Today we call Arabs, people in North Africa, but those are not, say, ethnically Arab, if not in a broader sense, not in a genetic one, right? In a cultural one, in a linguistic one, etc. How had the Umayyads come to power? These are things you must know, especially as a medievalist, very well. Doesn't matter what you believe in. The Umayyads had managed to consolidate their rule by leveraging multiple factors, effectively transitioning from the more consultative and community-based leadership of the Rashidun period, that was essentially the expression of a warlike, tribal, but in this sense more primitive and backward system, to a more power-concentrated dynastic statal one, which in the Umayyad era, in the Umayyad Caliphate, is centered in Syria. Then eventually this would shift with the Abbasids towards Iraq, but this had already been, let's say, in between German-speaking Syria and Iraq, had been hegemonized now by the Umayyads. Remember, this was technically a unique caliphate, again, from the Atlantic to Afghanistan. Naturally, the Umayyads really controlled just this regional Middle Eastern landscape, with a lot of decentralization already occurring for the outer provinces, of course. The fact that this was a normal civilizational step, the fact of establishing a more robust, permanent, organized, bureaucratic power with a permanent military, and of course antagonizing with other regional, provincial ambitions of autonomization when not of independence, and with, as you know, an early Islamic religious background that was yet to fully consolidate. Even just think about the Abbasids, think about all this, the enormous Islamic legacy and tradition that had not yet been fully regulated, was continually manipulated and even increased, modified. Such an empire, again, stretching from Spain to India, was not tenable in that way. There was a lot of criticism, particularly among those who favored Ali, cousin and son-in-law of the Islamic prophet, the last of the Rashidun caliphs that had been assassinated in 661, January the 24th, while performing the morning prayer, the fire in the mosque of Kufa in Iraq. He was struck with a poisoned sword by Abd al-Rahman ibn Muljam, a member of the Kharijites. This attack occurred during Ali's own caliphate in the context of the ongoing civil strife known as the First Fitna. This group was propagating, in fact, a blood connection with Muhammad, leading to the eventual rise of Shia Islam, that, as we will see now, took root mostly, still you can observe it today, but it could have changed at some point. At least it could have been more widespread as far as Persia is concerned, and Iraq as well. Part, as you know, Iraq is almost half and half. But it could have, Shia Islam could have been much vaster. For that, we should go, say, to the following century with Al-Mamun, but this is not what we're going to do here, also because we will abandon the Abbasids and pass mostly to the Emirate of Cordoba. But to make the long story short, after Ali's death, there was a significant power vacuum. His son Hassan briefly took the caliphate, but eventually abdicated in favor of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the governor of Syria, to prevent further bloodshed, and therefore recognizing fundamentally this Umayyad leadership. That, albeit embracing the notion of, say, a collectively elective system of power, did establish the state also with de facto its own dynastic affirmation, and therefore passage of power from father to son, right, leading to the, for all the reasons that we listed here, predictable ones, to widespread dissatisfaction among various groups, including non-Arab Muslims, the Mawali, so-called, who felt marginalized. Consequently, the Abbasid family, linked to Muhammad through an uncle as well, seized the caliphate and established a new capital in Baghdad, Iraq, a territory that had long been part of the Iranian Sasanian Empire, and therefore having, as it would be the case for the rest of Islamic history, including, you know, the Shia infiltration at the time of Al-Mamun, because really Persia is that close to Baghdad to begin with. It's always this looming presence on what was a more robust statal reality, but as you know, Persia is very feudal, is very active. We'll come back talking about Persian warfare as well during this time, because also the transition from Sasanian to Islamic power is crucial there. The Abbasid capitalized on the grievances of the aforementioned Mawali, offering a vision of a more essentially inclusive Islamic community where all Muslims, regardless of ethnicity, could be equals. As we'll see now, there are very important philosophical religious consonances between this the Sunni trend and this. Essentially, the Abbasids would be, as you know, Sunnis as well. They would be flirting, as we were saying, with the Shias, but they also had some sort of Shia backing and bias to some extent since the beginning, right? There was paradoxically a more rigid determinism from the Sunni, it would become essentially a majority, thus orthodox side regarding the succession of power and in part the affirmation even of a single dynasty to rule, whereas the Shia, starting from a more genetic principle, were also stressing the primarily spiritual race of the what would be essentially the as you know, the list of imams that essentially transfigured at some point were the expression of basically also like the first one to the others. It's something that there is some messianism behind that. We'll come back to Shia religion at some point. I made some videos about that, but not so many. So I presume that most of you are at least familiar with the topic, but I know it may not be entirely the case. Nevertheless, the Sunni Orthodoxy would maintain a more statal profile. The Shia heterodoxy, embracing a bit more of Platonism, would maintain that more warlike, also feudal background, mostly because they survived still in a fringe area compared to Mesopotamia, that is Persia. The Abbasid support towards all those who thought that they could be elevated to the same standard of the rulers. Remember, this had been the fundamental notion of the Catholic Empire in Roman times. Everybody believed that there could be, think about the Ottonians, the Franks before them, how the metaphysical ethnicity of Rome had to be essentially owned in order to re-elevate the world to that golden age. Right here, it's incredibly interesting how, of course, this is a blended background, Romano, Persian, essentially, mostly Persian from the Islamic side, that really is thinking in the same terms. That is to say, why has there to be like a case or a dynasty or a group that bars from power any other, right? This Abbasid policy was particularly appealing in regions like Persia, where many converts existed and had converted for that hope of metaphysical elevation. In Holy War, it was incredibly, again, it had been Persia would have fundamentally informed the jihad, right, the Arab Holy War, from a military point of view. Now, the Abbasid movement managed to forge alliances with various disaffected groups, including Persians, who were crucial in both undermining Umayyad authority and contributing to the military efforts against them, right? Because you have these two major regional Middle Eastern basins that are against one another. And also in a very deep sense, because Persia, as you know, had always historically tried to hegemonize the entirety of the Middle East, reaching the Levant, and in fact the very precious ports at the end of the Silk Route branches. Now the Arabs had essentially, as this primitive barbarian people, overrun them in what they had historically built in Mesopotamia as a solid state that, however, the Romans had destroyed multiple times, but had, at the end of the day, always been handled from the Iranian dynasties of the Persian plateau. That now, having recognized Islam as the victorious religion, because they had been defeated, their empire had been further destroyed by these, had converted, and now hope to regain exactly that Iranian mindset that lasts to this very day of trying to, and it also fails all the time, which is very interesting, by the way, to try to hegemonize again Mesopotamia, enriching the Mediterranean, of course, so that everything comes full circle. Although the Abbasid call was not exclusively Shia, it resonated, as we explained, with Shia sentiments due to its emphasis on the legitimacy of Muhammad's bloodline that had survived in the East, and criticism of the Umayyads for their perceived deviation from Islamic principles. The slogan Al-Rida min al-Muhammad, that is, the chosen one from the family of Muhammad, was crucial in gaining religious legitimacy in the struggle. It could have not been otherwise. The Abbasids portrayed themselves as the restorers of true Islam, other very ecumenic principle, criticizing the Umayyads, that, remember, were nominally at least at the head of the entire Islamic world, for their luxurious lifestyle and perceived deviation from the austere lifestyle of Muhammad and the early caliphs, that somehow resonated more in the sort of grim and feudal fortresses of Persia and the local chivalric military lifestyle. They promised to return to a more just and egalitarian society, which appealed to many. The use of religious rhetoric helped in framing their movement, not just as a political rebellion, but as a religious reformation or restoration. This narrative was effective in rallying support across different strata of the Islamic world. We are focusing on Persia now, but this really resonated among many other strata of Islamic society that had been growing intolerant of the Umayyad autocracy, centralization, tax policy, etc. The Abbasid revolution, so to say, was characterized by a series of strategic moves that successfully undermined Umayyad power in the Middle East. The initial uprisings occurred in Khorasan, So we're not even in central Persia. This is northeastern Iran, a very, again, frontier area that is a harbinger of this kind of novelties, because being more exposed to the steppes, it has sort of more tumultuous, unruly manpower at disposal for sort of swarming across the Iranian plateau and beyond, especially being weaponized by the Persian elites that are concentrated in western Iran, so just next to Mesopotamia, and being able to strategically and logistically arrange a proper invasion of the region. The Abbasids had strong support in Khorasan. This geographical advantage allowed them to organize and grow their forces away from the Umayyad power center in Damascus, that is from the outer, it's technically not even Middle East, that would be historically Near East, right? The Levant, Mediterranean. Never underestimate the regional composition of this immense Islamic world, right? Damascus is an ancient Semite center, eventually Hellenized, Romanized. Sure, there were Middle Eastern influences, but it was tendentially open to the Mediterranean. We also, as we've seen also in videos about later medieval warfare, maintain an important degree of urbanization. Khorasan is a completely different place. It's historically an Iranian quasi-steppe reality that now is also being overrun by the Turkic peoples, this Gulams that will in fact take over the military of the same caliphate later on. We will make more videos about, for example, the Abbasid army organization. So these are very differently counterposed worlds, right? They are worlds within worlds within a universe. As I was saying at the beginning of the video, you can't study, say, world history by seeing, in fact, especially Islam as a sort of monolithic reality. It's really not. And remember, these are areas that we have in part seen also through the Eurasian Steppe series, but we have to analyze. We really lack this big bridge of Sasanian history that we have to strengthen on Schwerpunkt, that really had constituted an ecumenic reality from a long time, and that at the same time had been very much in contact also with the further west, was aware of the Roman Empire, well aware of the Roman Empire, of course, and now seeing the situation changing so fast. For all those semi-nomadic peoples of Central Asia, this was an enormous opportunity just to seize, to loot, and more. Plus, religion was spreading more than its material weapons, right? So there are very long-range kind of contacts to determine how this world system can be organized once the war is over. Consider what the Arabs themselves successfully achieved from the Ebro to the Indus. So it's an immense reality that as Westerners we're looking at ourselves, like we don't have too much information about this, but Christians were also very aware, considering that Christianity had expanded with Nestorianism also far beyond, had reached China, had in this sense outranged Islam to a degree. The context, the awareness of this great cauldron that has yet to cool off are upsetting, especially as, I don't know, Charles Martel has to cope with the Moors. The Byzantines must strengthen their defense, etc. The Abbasids, during the war against the Umayyads, had charismatic leaders like Abu Muslim, who was instrumental in rallying troops and leading successful military campaigns. Their organizational system was effective in mobilizing a large, also composite army, many different people, war bands, military cultures, traditions. Nevertheless, an effective one that we will observe even better when, again, we'll talk about the Abbasid army organization. The pivotal battle of the Zab in 750 was where the Umayyad forces were decisively defeated, leading to the rapid collapse of their Middle Eastern rule. Right? This victory was due in part to the defection or neutrality of key Umayyad commanders and the superior motivation and numbers of the Abbasid forces. In other words, the system that had gradually softened up, had civilized, gentrified, despite stretching over an immense amount of land, was in fact very fragile in the foundations. Like all newly conquered realities, there were many leaders, many officials, many of them coming from families of converts and being co-opted into the Islamic regime and establishment, but being, as we were saying, very aware of the opportunities that a more decentralized local rule, just on the basis of what had historically existed up to the last century, the Byzantines had ruled there, etc. There were lots of Christians, importantly enough, in those lands, would help, say, the Abbasids. They are kind of angrier, and especially are now fully centered at large, in spite of their generally hegemonic and ecumenic ambitions, in Mesopotamia, in Baghdad. Yes, the Abbasid Caliphate is very large. It controls up to Egypt in the west at its greatest extent. It borders the Byzantines in the northwest. It has all this sort of Eastern Persian dimension towards that. Basically, you can't even simply see an end in this gradually diluting steppe frontier. We'll talk more also about those areas in warfare. I have something like this for the 11th to the 14th century about Eastern Iranian warfare. It's very Central Asian influence. We're not talking about the connections with India. So when you look at what was going on, you realize that this shift in dynasties through relentless fighting, armies moving across thousands of kilometers. Imagine the spaces here. We've seen it recently also for the previous centuries with Heraclius, really, starting from Africa, arriving up to Nineveh, where the Sasanians had been essentially destroyed, then they would be finished off by the Arabs later, fueled by a desire to return to the roots of Islam and the need to adjust the political framework for a vastly expanded and diverse Islamic populace. However, the same shift ultimately accelerated a significant process of regional decentralization influenced by various religious motives, and not only that, basically bring to the destruction of Islamic unity to this day, reaping the fruits of many preconditions of Islamic faith, including the, I would say, paranoid distrust towards any kind of secular authority, which engulfs Islamic civilization, in fact, into an irremediable sense of, need to regime change and gradual destabilization, like of statehood, like insisting, in fact, a further chronic distrust towards any kind of earthly institution. Again, in a radically different way from what Christendom was doing. We'll partly compare also some outcomes here between the two religions, and that derive fundamentally from the non-recognition of the unfitness of the current human and the human of the time in handling both essentially temporal and spiritual power. Christianity resolved this, right, for the lack of a better humanity in that moment after the fall, after the peak of the Golden Age, after the Roman Empire. Things went down. Again, and Christianity at least sanctioned the fact that at least humans could not simply now control unitary temporal and spiritual power. Islam does not have this because, as you know, yes, there are imams, there is a general repartition of let's say, of tasks, but Islam does not have a priesthood, right? And as such, every temporal ruler is also endowed with a spiritual task, starting from the caliph, that of course is the universal ruler. It would be like the equivalent of the older emperors that detained both power. But with this kind of results, these ones of disastrous fragmentation and fundamentally the impossibility of, after just one 100 years of this rule that had not yet reached those territorial extents, being very motivated. Jihad having that sort of furious fervor, that zealotic fanatism, capable of making Islam boom that way, riding, let's say, the wave of discontent that had an exhaustion actually of towards Byzantine rule, late antiquity, that Sebastocratic attempt also from the side of Constantinople in similar ways to pretend it was a way for emperors to still hold spiritual power by themselves, but actually crippling the system in the process, differently from Western Christendom, and things really started, in fact, taking off once again in a much more successful way later on with the cooperation of the papacy in the empire, because people focus on the antagonism, but when you look at that, they actually cooperated all the time. They never disconfessed each other as institutions. So this makes you understand in the deepest veins the radical divide and fundamental incompatibility between Christianity and Islam to begin with, but with very different historical outcomes, as you can see here. There would be so much to say, because these are very big, powerful statements that should be substantiated by further historiographical evidence, but minimally, when you look at the Abbasid movement, for example, that, as we've seen, starts also in a pretty fringe area, the ones in which you can argue that the holy warriors go in hermitage to sort of prepare for the struggle. This is, think about the Murabids in Morocco later on, or the monastic military orders in Christendom. The same identical reality. It had existed in Persia, it had existed even in Europe, in a sense. Much of the Celto-Germanic power sort of revival during the migration era was in part connected with those fringe spiritual practices. Well, the Abbasid movement in this way does overthrow the Umayyad dynasty in 750. We will talk about this also in its Iranian legacy in other videos. Really, that's the beauty of Schwerpunkt. You know that we will cover this stuff at some point. If I live, right, so far we covered too few, but there will be work on this. It's always been the case. Schwerpunkt military production is at full regime, as some of you pointed out. So after the decisive battle of the Zab, the Abbasids reaped the fruits of such preparation, leading, by the way, to the mass killing of Umayyad family members in Damascus. For the time standards, was a veritable bloodbath. One of the few surviving Umayyads was Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, known as Abd al-Rahman I. He was a grandson of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, a former Umayyad caliph. After the Abbasid victory, he escaped from the massacre, making his way through North Africa. Abd al-Rahman I eventually reached the Iberian Peninsula, where the Umayyad governor Yusuf ibn Abd al-Rahman al-Thiri was in control, but was facing internal strife and opposition from various factions, including the Berber tribes and Arab settlers. I think I've never made a video about, if not about, the Andalusian cavalrymen of the era, so we're looking at something very specific. When Abd al-Rahman I arrives in the Al-Andalus, capitalizes on the existing political instability. He rallied support among the Arab tribes loyal to the Umayyad legacy that he incarnated, as well as some Berber groups. And after a series of wars, including the Battle of Muzara in 756, he defeated Yusuf al-Thir and established himself as the Emir of Cordoba. Importantly enough, Abd al-Rahman I declared himself the independent Emir of Al-Andalus, effectively distancing the region from the new Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad that had the lion's share, yes, but just in a even more distant reality than the one that Damascus had been for Baghdad, right? So this is how the Emirate, later Caliphate of Cordoba, that sort of mimicked the Fatimids that were also a Shia, that the Andalus powers remained Sunni, right? But there was still at that point a lot of rivalry between all these various chunks that are, however, chunks now. There's no Islamic unity anymore, right? Not even in faith, probably. This passage is crucial because that's essentially how the Umayyad Caliphate becomes, or shrinks to, the Emirate of Cordoba. The Emirate title is very relevant because just as for the end of the same Caliphate of Cordoba, the Muslims were quite coherent in, remember that this thrust towards earthly power, they were so, caring about the actual level of divine power wielded by their leaders. A caliphate hadn't it actually had a universal scope. Later on they will call the emirate a caliphate in Cordoba, but at the end they will actually solve it by themselves. They literally sit at a table and said, this is not a caliphate anymore because it's falling apart, we're not worth of this name in front of God, and so this is solved. This is very interesting because Christianity, as we were saying before, was maintaining the notion of the imperium as the manifestation of divine power, but through a secular capacity that was on a not separated, but on a different level from the ecclesiastical one, right? So that you could have a whole Christendom, but multiple emperors. This is what essentially the Muslims will do, again, by naming themselves caliphs themselves, but always with the notion that they were the absolute rulers of the entire world. This was true naturally also for the Christian Empire, but to the degree that this sanction had to be recognized by the church as well, right? And so apparently, for most people, this would not make much sense. Say, well, what's the difference? This made all the difference. All the difference. Foundation in Western civilization for the actual functionality of the system, regardless of what it's called. Because again, Islam did not have that unity at all, as it even doesn't have today. And it's incredibly much more diversified since the very beginning. Again, the Umayyad Caliphate was just claiming, of course, that unity, until somebody probably said, no, you're out of order fundamentally. Because the Arabs were also, let's be honest about this, not much of a civilization to begin with. They had implanted themselves as a ruling elite into regions that had allowed them to do so, including Egypt, that literally opened its gates to the Muslims in order to escape the Byzantine control. Something that we've seen again in the recent video about Heraclius. This aspect of distancing that the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula do almost immediately from the Abbasids in Baghdad is quite important. It's twofold. From one side, it's a form of protest against the Abbasid revolution. From the other, it's just a psychosis of some sort of psychological drama stemming from the obvious defeat of the Umayyad regime. The Iberian Peninsula, as we've explained also in another video, does have almost an ecumenic dimension to these guys. It's obvious that the Muslims of the early conquests could have boasted a much greater result by arriving up to the Garonne, and Kyrgyzstan to the other side, still, however, as individual rulers. However, the Muslims of Spain start seeing this vast regional reality and also an extremely composite territory like the Iberian Peninsula from a political, cultural, and even ethnic point of view in truly ecumenic terms, so that not just there is a competition with the Fatimids, there are different schools of Islamic thought that are developing at this point. Spain maintains a very strong connection with Yemen, for example. There are wide, and this is the beginning of, say, the golden age of Islam, really, which is paradoxical because it started exactly in the moment in which the Islam fragmented, right, and established this course where this research, where this study, this inquiry was possible. At large, the Arabs were aware of the enormous treasures that they had found, they had seized, and they could indeed base themselves as regional powers claiming this greater suzerainty. In Spain, that was also the case. First of all, the Umayyads of Cordoba survived as a sanctuary and established an independent emirate. The Umayyads in Cordoba found a sanctuary that had survived from the Syrian massacres and had provided them with this essentially promised land in quite providential terms to restart, to preserve actually their own lineage, but to restart also a new age of rule. Their declaration of independence against the Abbasids, as properly the emirate known as Al-Andalus, encompassing much of the peninsula, by the way, at this point. This is the moment in which their conquista in the north is still there, but it's reduced to the bare minimum. Right? So there is really a sense of grandeur. There are connections with North Africa, with the rest of the Islamic world. This is a real regional power. It basically lives on the sort of Roman tradition of centralization, of probably a state with a permanent army, with a permanent bureaucracy, something that only the Byzantines and the Abbasids can afford, fundamentally at this point. The Latin-Germanic world works on a very different level, on a very different footing at large. We shouldn't overstate even the Islamic power or advancement or progress in these centuries. We're talking about some of the more generally depressed ones of the Middle Ages, but there is no doubt that Cordoba is a great power. Right? The city itself, the capital, was this ancient center of Baetica, really wielding an enormous power over the straits between Africa and Europe, managing essentially to hegemonize the entire Western, Central, Mediterranean Islam, essentially the later bases in southern France, the Emirate of Sicily, Tunisia, the other North African powers, up to Egypt excluded, would essentially revolve around Cordoba, would get sanction from Cordoba, would essentially imitate Cordoba. That was by far the more advanced place. However, this was not such a granitically unitary reality at all. Right? Regardless of the greatness of the capital, remember that that's where the power is concentrated. It's as if a Constantinople had existed while the rest of the provinces were doing so. Of course, this is also a different land from, say, the Byzantine one. This is a Latin-Germanic land. The Arabs have conquered this territory, not actually a long ago, like just a couple of generations from the Visigoths, that had really crumbled in pretty pitiful way because of lots of mistakes they objectively made throughout, especially the last phase of their reign, but mostly because of the fundamentals of power that we illustrated in different videos. We'll come back on the fact that the monarchy was not very solid. It wasn't really a unitary framework of territorial control. These lands had witnessed the survival of the Roman latifundium that would have also been part inherited, now much changed, barely recognizable by the Arabs, in a sort of feudal system that, or proto-feudal one, that had prevented the homogeneous control of the land. The same problems had been had by the Franks, that however had somehow more push. They sort of settled the fundamentals of their rule in Gaul in a much sounder way since the time of Clovis, and had fundamentally managed to preserve their imperial dignity, regardless of, say, the fact that here we are relatively distant from Charlemagne's crowning. It will happen in half a century later, but it was really already imperial in nature, and that in fact manages to stop the same Arabs in Aquitaine. I will not digress on. We still have to make a video about the Battle of Tours / Poitiers, and I'm 732, as well as the one of Hakroinon, Constantinople 717, etc. These are really very important battles. The Arabs also have a tendentially more egalitarian system, however, at the expenses of their warlikeness. At large, the Andalusian subjects are under this state, its taxation system. It is true, of course, that the same emirate takes on an ever more private and oligarchic direction. This was the early Middle Ages, and tendentially the Islamic world, as the Byzantine one, will go towards privatization, oligarchization, and the eventual collapse, this especially for the Arabs at the end of this so-called a golden age of Islam, a further degradation of their public system, right? Something very similar to what the Frankish, the Latin-Germanic world had, but not quite in the same way. The Latin-Germanic world is taking more time to consolidate, but it's doing it really with the right fundamentals. It will give it an extra gear with these other civilizations, but it takes time. A time that, however, is used to now foster. We're in the time of the early Carolingians. I made videos about the molding, the creation of Carolingian cavalry. At this point, like in the mid-8th century, really the Franks are strengthening this clienterly, vassalitic, beneficiary military system that will be able to reunite great swaths of Europe under probably a veritable imperial and revived Roman dimension. The Emirate of Cordoba in that sense is more limited. Yes, it's big, it's impressive, but as we were saying at the beginning, it has also its internal limits. For example, the Emirate faced serious internal rivalry among Arab clans, difficulties in coexistence between the dominant Arab population and the restless Berber tribes from Africa, as well as tensions between Muslims from different regions and the indigenous converts to Islam. Right? The Arab clans are the Arabicide elites that are quite, of course, jealous of one another. They have stuck together, in this case, under the Umayyad surviving umbrella, so to say. But of course, they're plotting against one another to rise to the emirate, right? There is also this problem that in order to control the local population, that at large is it's an Iberian one historically. It doesn't have much to do with the Arabs, and avoiding this to simply take over and or shake off the Islamic yoke from these territories. That is relatively mild. It's not like we have been bombarded for generations saying, "Oh, these Arab eras were so advanced, everything was so tolerant." But tolerance did not even exist, until up to 300 years ago, and in a very specific way as we intended. These Arabs had really come as conquerors. They had objectively exploited a widespread discontent among the local population. The Jews, for example, that had been radically mistreated by the Visigoths in the harshest Romano-Germanic anti-Jewish jurisdiction ever, had sided with the Arabs. But there were so many different Visigothic leaders that also defected, that understood that they could gain some autonomous power from this old. Some converted, actually, like many Visigoths, stood their ground and got themselves killed in the process. But the way the Visigothic kingdom crumbled really shows like there were very severe problems in the fundamentals of the same. The Arabs were not prone at that point to simply arm again the populace to create some sort of national army of Iberians led by by the Muslims. They also had a great sense of themselves. We've seen how the Umayyads had been displaced to begin with, overthrown, because they had been quite authoritarian and impositive. They had a strong sense of statehood, but also of autocratic rule. So they knew how to make things work, evidently as it happened in the Emirate, but they did so by tendentially trying to disarm the local populace, which was something that was actually occurring in other parts of the world. I mean, even the Frankish world was doing so. I mean, that was a very oligarchic system that was kept together by the possibility of expansion, and the functionalization for that mounted elite to succeed was the majority of the population working for them. We explained this countless times. There were more civilized, functional places in Europe, such as Longobard, Italy, that still existed at this point, was essentially the second Christian power in Western Europe after the Franks, that had, by the way, just reunited from the end of the 7th century, where there were virtually like 4 different kingdoms. At that point, the Longobards were the first power. So Spain was, had never been an explosion of independent civilization. Yes, the Romans had been there coastally. There had been other cultures, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, here and there. But at large, aside from these reinjections of manpower like under the Goths, the Suebi, etc., there had not been much, but fundamentally just a gradual preservation of the local Roman vestiges, right? As such, the actual hinterland of the Iberian Peninsula was relatively wild. I mean, the north was really wild. At this point, it was rallying around part of the Visigothic refugees that had set their minds on their conquista. They would relentlessly and successfully pursue for 700 years to victory. But at large, aside from the Ebro Valley and basically in Betica, if you look at central Spain, like the major Meseta highlands and so on, it's not a place where Romanity, for example, had overly preserved itself, right? It's hard to make comparisons without further videos on early medieval Europe, but let's say that the degree, at least, of decentralization was quite pronounced. It was already the case under the Visigoths. Mostly it wasn't even about the Roman fundamentals, but the fact that, those estates had not been reparceled like it had happened, for example, during the Longobard invasion in Italy, or, for example, in Anglo-Saxon Britain, right? So, hadn't the Arabs arrived, probably the Visigoths would have developed in something very powerful before time, perhaps suffering importantly from the Carolingian attacks or something, but still having a sort of more feudally robust system at some point, because towards the very end of the Visigothic kingdom they were trying to institutionalize certain seigneurial titles in order to co-opt these powerful provincial rulers that nobody could really control. For example, the Visigoths were never fully able to control Betica. That was by far the most advanced area, in fact, where the Arabs installed themselves. Not just because the Byzantines in part had controlled the coastlines, but because literally the local elites had been too powerful. And in part, of course, they had called the Arabs, or had signaled the Arabs that it was possible, just like it had happened in Egypt and elsewhere, to install some kind of powerful southern Iberian power. This definitely enhanced also elite's power, to the point that, as we've seen, most of the people are are severed from a professional military service. Yes, there are local levies, there is a militia from these cities. It's a pretty urbanized area as well. There's a lot of continuity. Also from the Roman period, probably we don't see, because the Arabs did not produce so much in the same ways the Christian world was, which is important, because they had a sort of much more Hellenistic mindset. We often think that, that the Hellenistic world was so much more culturally, scientifically, literally advanced than the Latin one. It's not true, right? Paradoxically was the Romans really went to libraries to actually read. Also, it's really Christianity that introduces the book as also a codicological structure, right? To read also in a much more individual way. In the Hellenistic libraries, nobody went. Just some court literates that read a minimal part of these immense treasures that eventually the Arabs inherited, but together with all this kind of secluded, exclusivistic attitude to power. They were great autocracies, and as such, they eventually sclerotized over time, a bit like the Byzantine one, in fact. Now, why this? Because we explained that there was a state, people paying for it, would defend it, would have even an expansionistic capacity to keep the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the military, who were these soldiers? Foreigners, right? The Arabs had invaded Spain generations before with, again, an Arabized elite, but mostly Berber tribes from Africa that were quite warlike. They were actually nothing impressive in strictly sort of tactical terms in the art of war, but they were primitive savages, and as such they were pretty good for being sort of final rank soldiery, right? That also in this sense did not have so much the support of the population for eventual uprisings, revolts. I mean, these were foreigners depending as such on the local emirs for pay that nobody else had in the country as professional soldiers, so not really, making it very convenient for these soldiers to rebel because the system sort of maintained them. Then, of course, there were, as we said before, always elites infighting, etc. But this mostly turned into some retinues fights between the various officials, vassals of sort, rather than anything. The problem with the Berbers was mostly the fact that at some point these guys would settle down. I mean, it wasn't like they were paid forever in just strictly monetary terms. Yes, Islam had mostly the greater trade circuit of the era, also in terms of monetary circulation. But, of course, this is an early medieval society. The actual measure of wealth was the land. And, of course, the Berber tribes that were at large semi-nomadic had come to fight to Spain for the Arabs, of course, for getting land. Right, this is what the Ghulams from the steppes would do in the Islamic world. So the Mamluks, it's always about the land. Once you settle these guys down, you envelop them, they gentrify. They lose their traditional historical military capacities, skills, specialties, and so you have to call others. Also because of all those tumultuous upheavals within the same Islamic elite, that is always sort of ready to disconfess the current ruler, to say, like, you're basically usurping God's place because you're not actually good for what you're doing. Who says this? I say it. There's no check and balancement. There is no clergy that looks at this, that disciplines the secular, unlike in Christendom, and especially in the Latin-Germanic world, differently from, again, Constantinople, that mostly thought they could kill popes. Look at how they ended. As a matter of fact, with popes launching crusades, taking the same Constantinople. So it's not such an easy reality. There are other Islamic powers around, including North Africa, later in Sicily, etc., like, that are a bit tumultuous. At large, again, Cordoba does succeed in hegemonizing the space, but it's not like they controlled everything. And there would always be some antagonistic power even within this Western Islamic world. It was also pretty bizarre. If you read 1001 Night, you know that the wizards, the sort of the pagan world, from a sort of Orthodox Islamic perspective, is always located in North Africa and these places. It's a bit like, what the French or the German crusaders thought of the Siculo-Normans that lived among at least a consistent Islamic minority in Sicily. that would make them sort of less trustworthy and more morally corrupted. These ideas correspond to a general view of the world in terms of the various latitudes, various climatic bands that corresponded to moral values at similia, right? There is this fundamental lack of trust towards the indigenous converts to Islam that, as we'll see now, mostly have done it because of it's been imposed on them, and or they have to pay a tax otherwise, and maybe they really just want to participate to the establishment. They want to contribute in a political sense to the entrenchment of their own prerogatives, so that it's not convenient, especially when the Muslims can go and sack, Santiago, for example, sanctuary, like to simply oppose themselves to the Arabs. They, again, are not very kind-hearted to begin with. They're very despotic, they're very autocratic. There is also a practical policy, including the establishment, in fact, of a great frontier in the north that is virtually independent from Cordoba, that sometimes sides also with Christian powers at this to get something in exchange. The frontier, there are various alliances. If you look at later times like El Cid, that there is a generally shared, even sense of chivalry between Muslims and Christians, and also very specifically Iberian kind that is partly influenced by the same Arab one that had historically existed, was loaded with, again, that Iranian, now also Turkic influences. This is something we've seen very often in art, in Spanish warfare from the later centuries, but still testifying to the continuity, in fact, of this earlier model. Cordoba is, as we'll see now, also the artistic center of Spain. That's by far the most advanced, the most civilized place. So there are various layers of control that it manages to extend up to the north, and also parts of southern Gaul that gets continuously infiltrated, even after Tours, right? The greatest Frankish accomplishment with the Battle of 732 is not really keeping the Muslims out of Gaul. Actually, they will remain up to the 11th century there and routinely invade, especially the south. It's mostly having knocked out Aquitaine as a virtually independent power, even though a former subject of the Merovingians that had gradually autonomized, by letting, in fact, the Moors destroying the Aquitanians and only then taking the Muslims on from Charles Martel's side. That was such a hell of a master plan, succeeding and allowing the Franks to expand their power further. Then, as you know, Charlemagne will invade Spain, will establish the mark again. Recently made a video about the before the Kingdom of Navarre, explaining how, as you know, the famous battles, plural, of Roncesvalles in the end of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century were actually inflicted on the Franks by Christian Basques plus Arab, like Islamic Moorish forces. They were also mixed. There were also Islamic Basques, as we've seen at that point, but also lots of Christians that remained living within Islamic Spain. That's, as you know, yet another major topic of it all. In fact, there were strains between Muslims and the vibrant Jewish community of Spain. The Jews had largely facilitated the Islamic task of conquering the Iberian Peninsula, but it's not like they were particularly well treated nor enjoying this heaven under the Arabs. There was a lot of Jewish activity, including treating Christian slaves, castrating them, selling them for the harem of Cordoba. So pretty nasty stuff. There were lots of Christians cooperating. The so-called Mozarabs, as we know. From the other side, specularly, when the Reconquista took over, there would be the the Umayyads. I even made a video about them for the military historical unit series, that are the actual Muslims and Jews that remain for centuries in very vast minorities. We think up to 40% in the Kingdom of Valencia alone. Check the video about that realm out for the historical regional series if you're interested. As this Iberian power established also from the Christian side after the Islamic model mostly, on the fundamental assumption of universal rule over this land and all the religions within it, because this is essentially a world on its own. It's a universe, and so in order to rule over it, you have to rule over everyone. This is what the traditional view of the castes stated, right? There was no equality whatsoever between any of these people, even from a person to another, from any side, but there was a hierarchical organism that required an overarching leadership that was tendentially ecumenic in nature. This is extremely important. The Mozarabs were, in fact, these indigenous Christians who were somewhat Arabized and often bilingual by this point, right? Generations spent under the Arabs had at least informed them in the rudiments, in the essentials of if anything, the administrative Arab that was used to rule them. Furthermore, the emirate contended with security issues from the Christian Visigothic kingdom of the Asturias. I say Visigothic because in part it was the heir to that, even though the real legacy from the Christian side, identity-wise, during the Reconquista was not much a Visigothic continuity, but a Christian one, because they really felt the pressure from the emirate, later the caliphate, and Christianity was this absolute sense of unity and esprit de corps expressed by this community during all stages of their conquista. Consider that these people had early connections with the papacy that under the Visigothic kings had been largely ignored, because the councils of Toledo wanted to behave as a sort of a second alternative to Rome after Constantinople, the ecumenic councils of which were imitated. The councils of Toledo were extremely Byzantine in style, right? There was a very strong Byzantine influence in Spain before the Arabs arrived, right? Even after the Byzantines had actually left in the later stages of Visigothic rule that had at least managed to fundamentally oust, if not to control the coastline, but at least to oust the imperial troops that had in part withdrawn just because Arabs, that was, the main concern. Constantinople had much more important things to think about than, the other end of the Mediterranean. We're talking about very, very vast spaces, right? Especially for early medieval times where resources are radically short, and in general, it's not like mobility was very big, as the Arabs themselves showed, as the Byzantines showed when they had the means to, say, knock out the Sasanians in the very Iranian plateau. But once that ends, it's useless. In fact, the Byzantines would never set foot there anymore. To think to recover all these lands were so peripheral, while the same Constantinople was threatened existentially by Islam, right, by the same Arabs. In any case, for Cordoba, the north was the pain in the behind for everyone who had ever ruled Spain. Especially, it's very similar to what had happened during the Visigothic kingdom. The north was formally under the southern rulers, but it was never fully controlled. They could send punitive expeditions, you could make this enormous displays of power, as we just said. For early medieval standards, mounting up a massive expedition across the Meseta, these are immense spaces, rich in the north, also for very few kind of material gains, because the north was poor, was primitive, was really, again, inhospitable in many ways. Yes, there were resources to gain here and there, but the main point of the Arabs was showing off, was actually trying to convince the Christians of the northern principalities that, after all, Islam was kind of their rightful ruler, their master. This responded not also at the cost of brutal massacres and relentless fighting. But in a general sense, there wasn't much that even the Visigoths could do, for example, with the Basques back in the day. This would keep raiding and raiding towards the south. It was just their lifestyle. They didn't even care about who was there, right? They were just incredibly brutal and primitive cattle raiders. They spent all their existence cutting throats and raping, pillaging, whatever, and that was just their style. They didn't have a better way of living because local resources were just too scarce. In the rugged terrain of the north, in those valleys with ever less resources, like war bands had to be sent forth, like out of there to gain better land, fresher pastures. Except at that point you would meet the Arabs, and so you had to fight. And it's that vicious and brutal. I mean, the Arabs also deport these people, they enslave them, they can't do the worst. They are an intelligent power. They will have very strong diplomatic ties and coordination with the Franks, with the Ottonians, especially later on. It's all an interesting and important history that we will have to cover more in depth later on. But concentrating on this, we can observe that the Asturias, emerging in the northwest following the Christian resistance after the fall of the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo, was quite an ideological threat to that ecumenic ambition of the Umayyads that, remember, up to a few years before had essentially been ruling the world, the Islamic world, something immense. And now we're threatened in the very center of the rule from some barbarian infidels from the north that did not even represent a credible threat hadn't they been sponsored, supported by the Franks, which was the great deal of the situation. The Franks always infiltrated, also in Visigothic times, in the northern mountains from the Pyrenees, trying to, in fact, carry out proxy wars against the Visigoths and having their presence being felt. The Franks are really mounting in terms of continental power, so they really are displaying a great deal of force. Cordoba is from the opposite end of the peninsula compared to the Pyrenees. Also, the Franks are not just next door, because their actual ethnic heartland is north of the Loire river. But again, if you have resources, as especially towards the later 8th century, the world will start gaining a little bit. There are these pretty interesting initiatives like, again, Charlemagne's invasion of Spain, establishment of the Spanish market, and in spite of the general frailty, instability of the regional order and balance, would survive. This will also largely give rise to Catalonia, right, as one of the protagonists of the Reconquista. Just recently, again, I made a video about the origins of Navarre, but if you look at the related videos in the fixed comment down below, there is that other video I made on the origins of Catalonia, Navarre, of Aragon, right, that are all also rooted not just in this Frankish support, but at some point also a proper Islamic government of those very areas. We've seen it in Pamplona. It was an Islamic graveyard there. This other, Zaragoza, Barcelona at times were ruled by the Muslims as well. So we're looking at a very interesting scenario that in the northern frontier gets pretty crazy in terms of allegiances, of stability. It's practically impossible again to simply sediment a strong power there because there is not enough surplus, and even previous basins of civilization. The Ebro Valley is rich, the Mediterranean side especially, but the interland is a completely different story. And controlling the Iberian interland is pure nightmare, right? As I always say, nobody really knows which southern region is worse as a battleground between Spain, Italy, and the Balkans. Because whoever fought there, had always not an easy time at any point. Despite these challenges, the Emirate of Cordoba prospered in these generations. There was an early push that really lasted until the end of the 10th century, consolidating a hell of a regional power and wealth. The Islamic presence contributed to the rise of a mercantile estate, fueled by the Islamic monopoly on the major Mediterranean trade routes, the upper hand in trade balance. In other words, the Muslims had more precious metals than the northern European shores. Cordoba being really the center of this, the sun around which the other Western Central Mediterranean Islamic powers gravitated around. We do witness the revitalization of ancient cities, especially in Baetica and Andalusia, but not only, right? There are other Roman saints, mostly. The Iberian Peninsula had only Roman cities. The Visigoths had established some military colonies that also grew in medieval times, but at large, here we're witnessing with the re-expansion of traffics, of, say, agricultural output towards the end of the 8th century, a substantial reinvigoration of all this hilltops, mostly in Spain, fortified, urbanized by the Romans, refortified also in medieval times, that will become a bit the nightmare of every commander during the Reconquista. At this time, mostly hegemonized by the Emirate. So a very wealthy area in absolute terms. There was a lot of surplus, allowing for the development of a significantly bureaucratic state apparatus that could control better the system with a tighter grip, exacting, however, its cost, its toll as well. So much so that, again, the northern frontier was mostly vassalatic reality, right? Mostly relying on local resources. This development is particularly remarkable when compared to the relatively modest economic and political systems of most of Latin-Germanic Europe during the early Middle Ages. We talked about this for the Franks a bit. This is especially true in the light of the Visigothic kingdom that was overthrown by the Arabs. There was a greater, let's say, potential in the particular fabric of Latin-Germanic society and politics that would, as a mountain tide, overwhelm the same Islam. The protagonists at large were the same Iberian rulers as far as Cordoba was concerned, but as you know, there were lots of other Western Europeans participating in the Reconquista. Italy was highly civilized. It was really the more urbanized, the richer land per capita wealth, etc. I made a video explaining the sort of the hard-to-die myth of Latin-Germanic backwardness that lots of people seem to have developed in the last decade or so, essentially overstating Byzantine productivity, capacity, civilizational output. Latin-Germanic Europe, especially Gaul and Italy, were really top-notch in early medieval times. Most people do not study them because they just think either about tribes in the Barbaricum that really, especially after the migration era, had failed going anywhere, were not living really very well, and or looking at just, I don't know, some, that sense, only relatively, I would add, backward Anglo-Saxon reality, because the Anglo-Saxons too shared, and very much at this point, that kind of spiritual and temporal axis together with Rome, with the Franks, and really heavily contributed to Western superiority over time. The same survival of a Christian world in northern Iberia, albeit very sui generis, is symptomatic of some Western potential that was, first of all, salvaged, but also able to simply re-expand in a clamorous way, and that wasn't eventually too backward, at least in some areas that were essentially retaken by Christianity relatively early on, and with some, in fact, previous Western bases. Remember that the same Emirate of Cordoba is not an Arab product as a whole. It's largely an Iberian one, a Western one, with Arabs ruling over it, which is a very different story. This is the truth also for the Abbasids, also for the earlier Umayyads of Syria, right? I can't stress this enough when it comes to the Muslims. The general trend of historiography is stressing, as I was saying before, how advanced they were, how rich they were. Look at the great Mesquite of Cordoba, look at, I don't know, gold, whatever. Yes, but this is what you can say about the Byzantines as well, where a society was also very sclerotic. It's not like the Iberian countryside was particularly more affluent or developed than, say, the Italian or the Gallic one, right? It doesn't make much sense to presume so. Generally speaking, the northern you go, the worse it is in European terms, not just in European plus Mediterranean terms, because again, North Africa is far behind the northern Mediterranean coasts. So also Cordoba is mostly like a sack of Islamic rule within a Western world rather than else. Like Christian Spain would also be a very advanced place in the following centuries at large. So it's here I have a site open with a map of Europe and looking at it, even just by latitude. It's true, the Iberian Peninsula is a world on its own, but when you realize what the Franks managed to do by hegemonizing Gaul, finally accomplishing the conquest of Germany, started by the Romans, ideally in that sense, taking over the Italic kingdom and expanding further along the Danube, and securing that homogeneous political, cultural, religious system that Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe quite significantly as a legacy is, that keeps expanding like crazy from the 10th century. Like Europe is overwhelmingly unstoppable. So looking at the second half of the 8th century, we can still say, well, Latin-Germanic Europe seemed like it was only gradually putting itself back together, but fundamentally the main kingdoms out there already existed. Regardless also the Frankish political divisions at some point, they were mostly a matter of clientery swings. The core of power concentrated in northern France, Benelux, speaking in today's terms, would remain unaltered. Italy was advanced like hell. Spain is advanced like hell, especially in the south. Then it's also this vast territory that is so as well. So overstating even there the greatness of the Emirate of Cordoba as an Islamic civilization is probably not so useful. It's good. It makes sense. It's the product of some general shifts in civilization, in culture, in power dynamics. But if you look at the broader Islamic world in many ways, we should reassess much. I made multiple videos actually explaining this aspect well, given that we're talking essentially the Mediterranean rather than a veritable interland. North Africa does does not really have an hinterland at large, especially compared to Europe in terms of inhabitants, of, again, manpower, agricultural output, and so on. Many Saracens were actually Christians. Very few people know this, but if you look at the piracy of it all, first of all, most of these Saracens, we can say the Arabs, there is also in the 19th century was this obsession with racial purity and pollution. Like, why are Southern Europeans darker? I must have been the Arabs, right? Because otherwise, can't explain why it was a Roman Empire and then not. Most Saracens were actually people from Spain, from southern Italy, right? In the Eastern Mediterranean, they were Greeks in large numbers, right? And even properly Christian people, baptized, like they coexisted also with us. So if you're curious about that, because really other than Cordoba, there isn't much in the central Western Mediterranean that can compare as a state. You can check those videos out, and when you see on a map instead how big the Frankish Empire really was, say compared to Cordoba, you realize it had some intrinsic limits. It fell, but the outcome, like the capacity of keeping Europe together, even after the political unity of the empire, with that same direction, the papacy was leading the game, guys. That's a fundamental aspect that I was pointing out before to explain how Europe succeeded in what it did over these other powers that you must not overstate. Because from these people's sides today, of course, there is just at large rampant nationalism. So everything that, we are on YouTube. I don't have to repeat what kind of comments you get every time, you get on under, say, you read under certain videos. From our Western side, it's always, oh my God, these people were terrible. We were about to be overwhelmed. No, that's never happened, right? Even if the Arabs had taken, say, Constantinople, that maybe would have been the bigger deal. But if especially in the West, and in a comparative, that's the point. The Byzantines stopped them, right? That's the thing you want to first of all assess. In history, it's not what if. History is what happened, and it's already complicated enough to reconstruct. So let's stick to that. Europe won there, and it won at the same Poitiers, where again the notion that if the Arabs had won would have taken over Europe is complete nonsense, of course. For Constantinople, it's really different. That was much more crucial, and it was also because when Constantinople falls, there was literally nothing that can live on. You can have tiny chunks of stuff, but Constantinople is like Cordoba, it's like Baghdad, it's like Damascus, it's like Cairo. If you take that out, there's no other center surviving. It's more like a single polity standing from that city only, right? Especially at this point where basically ancient cities had been shrinking, especially actually in the Byzantine world, because the biggest cities were actually in Western Europe, right? And also in the Islamic world, of course. But they were much more punctiform, right? There isn't this, for example, in Islam, this robust urban development at a vast level like in the West. There are massive big cities that are the capital of everything, and then outside of that there's barely much, right? Yes, there are other towns. It's not like they are underdeveloped places, especially on the Mediterranean, because that had been Roman, had been Greek, and of other civilizations before. But it doesn't compare at all with Latin-Germanic Europe, especially with Italy, with southern Gaul, and even with parts of Spain, right? And speaking of urbanization only, it is not everything. It is not necessarily also what you can make an empire from. You must make an empire from. But if this is the lowest that Latin-Germanic Europe was in relative terms compared to these other cultures, even assuming that these would have at any point been really superior in terms of stability and consistency and power, which I don't think there is evidence of, because they didn't win the struggle, not even on the short term, the Visigoths being the only exception. There is Really not much to say about the overall quality of the West throughout all the rest of the period. This is something that people, especially Westerners, tend to underappreciate. Because I understand coming from another place, say from a Muslim country, and just because of how those countries are not really understanding or knowing or caring in objective, critical, valid, historiographically backed terms, those countries at large haven't developed an actually scientific and objective historiography. They haven't, historically. We have that only in the West. There isn't even in Russia. You can imagine how, it can't be in a Muslim country. But knowing, let's say, as Westerners, the fact that the average person doesn't care, or at least makes up this fake mythology of at some point we were under the threat of annihilation in the sense that we were weak to begin with, doesn't hold from a historical point of view. I have studied the Middle Ages for a long time, and the single most shocking thing that I learned in decades is that basically the West was continuously way more developed compared to other cultures than we've always been told. Like, most people think it's just, starting from the Enlightenment. It has nothing to do with that. It was constitutive. It started from antiquity, from at least the rise of the Hellenic world, but in a more deeply foundational way, because it's not just written history that makes the difference. Look at the Italics, look at the Celts. There is something there that you may want to consider from much earlier on than you imagine. Right? The West was actually one of the most early literate places in the world. People do not realize this. If you look at the spread of writing in ancient cultures, mostly you realize that it spread among some particular basins in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in India, etc., in China. But it's true, the West arrived later, but when you look at, for example, the spread of literacy in Italy and from Italy to the West, you realize that we went very far. Like, most of these other cultures remain surrounded by more primitive tribal realities, whereas especially the Roman Empire engineered a veritable civilization of peoples that literally even changed their own language on their own. It's something utterly insane. And not just as a language of the elites, but a language of the actual people, right? Talking Gaul and talking Spain, for not talking about those places where Latin was spoken before, say, they were a bit more Germanized, like in Britain, or Slavicized, like in not even totally, in the Danube, for example. The Danube spoke Latin, did not speak Greek during the Roman Empire, and that's very heavily forgotten. There is a heavy trace of this in Serbo-Croatian as well. You understand how many beautiful things you can sort of carve out from this historical topics. I would never actually stop. This is so amazing, and it's only by talking about this topics that you can sort of eviscerate them. Finally, I would point to this, that there was a notable cultural syncretism emerging, most prominently showcased in the architecture of mosques during the early Umayyad Emirate in Cordoba. It was also reflected in the construction of Mozarabic churches. The Great Mosque of Cordoba began in 784 under the rule of Al-Rahman I. Is perhaps the most iconic example, of course. It combines elements from Visigothic, Roman, and Byzantine architecture with Islamic design. And it's just one of the... we could talk about other churches, but they were built later, also in the Christian world, influenced by the same... talk of Spain, influenced by the same Cordoba at large, and you can't avoid to see the syncretism between also Christian Spain and the Andalusian forms. That you would say they're Islamic, yes, but they're also strictly Iberian. right? Or at least at large, they do distinguish themselves in their Iberianness, right? If one reasons in terms of clash of civilization simply pretending that there were some cleanly cut cultures opposing each other like two monolithic blocks, well, you will not go very far. Not even during the Cold War, there were actually two neatly distinguished blocks. It's just an it's a politically literate misunderstanding of reality, without making any moral relativism about the fundamental opposites that exist in here as well, which people tend to do all the time. The Christians and the Muslims were fighting against one another. They were antagonistic. They really hated each other, but at the same time, they knew each other. They knew how to sort of deal with one another. They arranged like a way to cope with systems that were outside their own and that represented an anomaly. For example, a very interesting topic, and we'll hopefully cover at some point in, let's say, some mostly history of literature video, is how the Christians perceived the Islamic world. Like, where did that spring from? Like, if you went to school, in the late 21st century, in the early 21st, you've been presented normally Christianity and Islam as two things that sort of exist foundationally, because today the world is somehow divided between them and a few other major religions, right, at large. The point, in a strictly traditional and Catholic sense, is not that simple at all, because these are not alien systems to one another. They are, to a very big extent, when you look at the relative terms, of course, of the historical conventions that we've been given. But in a strictly transcendental and metaphysical terms, like what did it mean that Islam existed, for example, in a Christian sense? It's not random, evidently, right? And vice versa. Like, for again, what's the role like of Islam to begin with? And that's something which the other religions had to cope with for their sins at large, just like the Muslims cope with the others for their sins. There is an order of nature where there can't be equality, and therefore there can't be just two rights or two wrongs at the same time. History is difficult when it comes, paradoxically, to the bigger understanding. I think that after several years of YouTube, I can assert this without doubt. I mean, the fact that at large people have very easy and simple fact-checking means to establish if one minimal information is correct, because of course it takes much less commitment. It's much more sort of easy base, like everybody can Google that and find out. What I think may have never existed, but at least was more more understood by a shared elite worldwide, like a few generations ago, today does not exist anymore. I mean, today because generally speaking, people are ever less selected. As such, they also, wherever they reach any kind of position in education and teaching, whatever, they are they're not really qualified. They're hyper specialized sometimes, but they're not able to see things beyond that field of specialization. Therefore, the bigger picture very often escapes them. You would think you go to university, and the real university is not the ones where you have Marxist professors. They exist, by the way. In fact, they're the best in the world. And even when they're very intelligent people and they know a lot, I have great respect for many of my, actually not many, but some of my professors, and including those who followed me over the years when I was still a student. But when they're pleasant people to talk with, right? For that reason, because mostly there is some shared interest, some shared time, dedication to history, etc. But when you tend, and they are experts in their own field, in their own regard, but when you address topics like today's videos, you understand that they suddenly start saying incredibly boring, plain, basically also cliches at the end of the day, really not really anything very consistent, thought out, reflected upon. This is really really a problem that denounces the fact that you can have an intelligentsia that is conventionally realized as such just because they studied a lot, but it's not like you have a check on what they have studied and how, right? This is important, of course, because different people eventually, the easiest way to stimulate some kind of reflection on issues in general occurring in the world and how things normally happen is to let them follow different paths. And so simply let people eventually confront with one another on these and ultimately realize that reality is complicated other than just complex. And so it's quite of an issue at large to try to sort it out, because it's very easy for people to have those basic ideas. Like on YouTube, it's all the time like this. You get zero criticism in any kind of elaborated fashion. The only people who disagree with you are people saying, no, this is not like that, and it stops there. Like, imagine this for maybe, I don't know, hundreds of comments so far in the channel's history, and not even one that goes beyond and or stays on topic or has basically no other, say, secondary reason, or incredibly narrow and understandable in this sense, like recognizable in this sense, a system of reference that you can understand the limits of, right? This is very very interesting to spot. It's something that really stays with you as it's so universal, it becomes dull, embarrassing. In fact, it feels really lonely, telling the truth. I must say that the more you go on with history, the less you feel like that there is anyone sharing what you what you find out, right? And since literally other people have no reference for what you have discovered, it seems like they simply can't understand. They can't evaluate whether you're telling them is correct, simply because they don't have the time to check it themselves. And it takes not just, again, a fact checker or Grok telling you what this is about, but literally the same path process that brought you there, that shapes your brain in a certain way over the years, storing a lot of information, but mostly combining it with one another. And if they don't have it, they can't understand. It's as if you went to, I don't know, again, you tell to someone things are like these, and eventually they never heard nor what these things or these are, and so how can, even if they maybe understand that you have some advanced knowledge, which is tendentially what people tend to really perceive by themselves, and sometimes even feeling threatened by. They will, however, not not essentially being able to express that. It will not be able to reciprocate, to correspond. And again, there are ways and ways to bond in this situation, but it's much lonelier than you think. How do you cope with this also with other people? Because I know this often happens. Well, I think the best way is to check your own bias, to check your own shortcomings. I mean, the best way is for you to be prepared, right? What is happening with knowledge, with learning, etc. Normally is that you're learning something so that you are filling gaps in your knowledge to the point you can hopefully be prepared to everything, right? This is what we generally also as historians fear the most, is that somebody tells you something that you've never heard of and you're not able to. This is what my tutor told me was it's real. You're not able to respond in terms of, well, yeah, that I know, or I can relate to, I can confirm or not, right? Where there are students that come up to you and say, is this that? And you maybe don't even know what they're talking about. It happened to me too. There was somebody making a question, and I said, "What the?" It's not like I didn't know what they were talking about, but the question is also, why do we even ask that? You know, it's so irrelevant, or it's so, you know, what are you doing that for? Do you want attention? Is it a broader game? I don't know. It's just not clear. And in fact, the best people you can have a conversation with still are those that really get you. Even if they don't know what you're talking about, at large they have enough background to understand why you're saying what you're saying. What is there behind it? Like what is the likely path that you follow to get to those conclusions, and what you think may be going on, even in terms of your own bias. That's why it's more interesting then. It's more interesting, again, it's not like you can't have a conversation with somebody else. Actually, it's much better to have conversations with people who are not of that kind in everyday life, especially if you have to get married. You want to have someone that, I don't know, maybe is more receptive than, that say stimulates you in life to improve yourself. In fact, in those fields, you're worse rather than once you're better, right? It's the great magic of marriage and why it works. But it's also a matter of getting some deeper things, and the capacity of essentially sharing them, and at least delivering the essential, the core of your work or what you do. And people antagonize on the internet. It's always been like that. It's always going to be. It's obviously challenging. Otherwise, I wouldn't be out here, right, talking about this stuff. At large, it's funny. In outline, you tend to be. You have to learn constantly. If you learn constantly, you can't really go beyond. Today, for example, I read you this comment. This was the Latin title. I didn't publish it, but to say that I published things. The Latin Empire of Romania. The Latin Empire of Romania, in brackets, an introduction. And this guy, that is surely, I don't say where he comes from, but it's funny because they're always after this kind of countries in general. What Romania, bro? Latin Empire, Romania, haha. Laughing with tears. This guy. What can you do with this people? Did you wonder why you don't publish these comments? You want to spare this person from the embarrassment of his own self. This is a low limit. Like, if you don't know what that means, of course, you are at the same guy's level. I don't wish you to be there, but I know that my followers know the difference. The problem is well, it would be easy to explain to this guy. I could even answer in a message, but I don't want to waste time because that's not why I'm here. But I mean, sometimes this was funny. I took it as a joke, and that's why he took it as a joke as well. So we both had fun. But you see, that the point is, these people exist for real, and the abyss that divides you from them is, at least in the strictly historical field, a problem sometimes, because you assume that others follow you the same path, and they don't. And so misunderstanding will happen. This is what I'm saying, that I don't have time to cope with these kind of misunderstanding, because I can't use a disclaimer in the title, Romania is not the modern country of Romania kind of stuff, because it would be dumb. It would do more harm than good to Schwerpunkt. But if this is a kind of a misunderstanding of the type, like this guy doesn't even know basic monolithic history, you understand, even a person that can understand much more, these people paradoxically are less, I mean, this person is really doesn't do anything wrong at large. Whether he writes this or not doesn't change anything. The problem is that there are people who spend considerable amount of time making some very weird historical reconstructions that you also are based on maybe 50 assumptions of this, almost this kind of stupidity, and there is some substance to it, but the entire system is so rigged that it doesn't make any sense. And these people take it as a form of pride, like, I say it, so it must be important, or I must be intelligent. I took the time to know these 50 things, and so I must be such a prepared, competent person. That's not how it works. And it's a matter of practice. I made multiple videos explaining how you learn, how what kind of mental process you go through, and over the years I'm also forgetting it myself, so I truly don't have the time for it at large. But I hope that at least by listening to all these Schwerpunkt videos at a time, you can get some of the sap, let's say, of this all, without getting hurt, without making comments like, "What Romania, bro? Latin Empire, Romania, haha," kind on the video on the Latin Empire, Romania. So that's kind of very interesting. I'm getting intrigued by this guy's profile now, because this account, I will not give you the name because there is a name, and this guy, I think I understand where he comes from. But the picture just itself is too fun. Yes, it's how I thought. It comes from a bordering country, we'll just say. This is fantastic. The funny part of this is that this guy's country was contained by the Latin Empire of Romania. The guy does not even know that. That's the funniest thing ever. Anyway, you probably understood. Well, no, you didn't, because there are a bunch of countries it could be, but I will not specify. But you understand, unfortunately, what I'm talking about. In this case, because otherwise I have great respect. I cover those countries' histories, as you know. We will keep talking about similar topics. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.